I have such a great time at Dinner and a Show here in New York City. If you'd like to come here for Dinner and a Show, it's not just because then it gives me a great time. Together we can honor Free Speech TV. But it is my great joy to toast Free Speech TV with you. Dinner and a Show. The show is Democracy Now! You watch the show live at 8 in the morning here in our studios. That's 8 Eastern time. We tour you through Democracy Now! You meet the guests in studio. We have a fantastic time. And then I get to host you and your guest for dinner. And I did this last night. And two of my guests were Vanessa and Ariel. And they have become best friends. They came from New York, but only met in New Orleans, where they were roommates for 3 years. And Ariel has loved Democracy Now! For so many years. She's now in medical school. So her dear friend, who lives in Rockaways in New York, Vanessa, did a fundraiser for Ariel to be able to come for Dinner and a Show. More than 80 people contributed. They made their investment in Democracy Now! $2,000 tax-deductible contribution, and Vanessa and Ariel came for dinner last night, and they watched the show today. And as I'm doing this with you today, as I'm urging you to come for Dinner and a Show as well, they are touring through Democracy Now! With Jemiah. We urge you to call in right now. It is such an honor. It was such an honor to meet them last night. Your call makes a difference. You make it possible. We had such a great time. So let me talk about the dinner we have together, and I'd love to host you. Also, Tim and Justin were here from Florida, and their story was amazing as well. And it was Justin's birthday, and it was Ariel's birthday. And so we sang them happy birthday. It's just amazing. And if you've been there and want to come back for more, I don't call you recidivist. I call you family. It is so wonderful to see you again. Sometimes people do this 4 times over and 5. And we so deeply appreciate it because you're supporting Free Speech TV. We urge you to call. We ask you to stand up for independent media. Your contribution of $2,000 for Dinner and a Show goes directly to Free Speech TV. You don't have to know when you can do this. Just make the pledge. And then you get your name in the reservation book before we close it. And so many people have been calling in for Dinner and a Show now. We may be closing it soon. So you get your name in the reservation book. Then my colleague Jemiah here at Democracy Now! Emails you. Once you've made that pledge, made it to Free Speech TV. And she says, hey, when would you want to come to New York? You might say, hey, I'm coming in a few weeks for something else. Is there any chance? Yes, there's a very good possibility. You might say, I have no idea. I'll get back to you in 6 months. You might say, I don't think I'm coming to New York for a year. All these answers are fine. All I'm saying is when you get here, we're going to have a fantastic time. The dinner is a life journey conversation. Yeah, it's great food. But even better than that is the food for thought. Because I get to hear your life stories, you and your guest. Maybe you want to celebrate your partner's birthday or an anniversary, a graduation, a holiday. You just want to celebrate Free Speech TV. We will toast Free Speech TV. We will break bread together. And if you're gluten-free, we'll break gluten-free bread together. But we'll have a great time. And we get to talk about the world together. You get to hear your thoughts on the world, the story of your life, where you've been, what you're doing now, what you'd like to be doing. It's transformational. I can just say that. I'm never going to forget Tim and Justin. I'm never going to forget Vanessa and Ariel. We had such a great time. And now they're touring through Democracy Now! And meeting everyone. We urge you to call. Again, it's a $2,000 tax-deductible charitable contribution that goes directly to Free Speech TV, and then we take it from there. We'll email you, and whenever you want to come to New York, we can't wait to greet you here. It's the greenest internet TV radio studio in the country. We'd love to tour you through it. You watch the broadcast. You meet the guests in studio. You meet the amazing team that makes Democracy Now! Happen. 877-378-8669 is the number to call. You can pledge $50 to get Timothy Snyder's book. You can pledge $2,000 for Dinner and a Show with Amy Goodman. The book and the DVD are yours for $100. The DVD is our extended interview that Juan and I did with the Yale historian for $75. Put them together for $100. 877-378-8669. Every library should have this book on tyranny. Every school should have this book. Every community center. $50 contribution. Please call in right now. 877-378-8669. Make the call that makes it possible for Free Speech TV to happen. We have all sorts of little gifts, too. Ceramic mugs, travel mugs, T-shirts, baseball caps. You can ask the person who is taking the call, 877-378-8669 or freespeech.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.
Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez, Democracy Now! Combines news reporting, interviews, investigative journalism, and political commentary with an eye toward documenting social movements, struggles for justice, and the effects of American foreign policy. But did you know that Free Speech TV was one of the first independent media networks to broadcast Democracy Now! Our history together runs deep. This is the real news mainstream media doesn't want you to know. Keep watching, keep moving forward. Stay educated and stay organized. Supporting independent media brings power back to the people. Call 877-378-8669 or donate online at freespeech.org.
Hi, I'm Amy Goodman, host of Democracy Now! I invite you to become a member or renew your support during Free Speech TV's year-end membership drive. I urge you to become a member of this activist community. Join Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people. Thanks for watching.
I appreciate Free Speech TV for bringing me programs that can't be found on any other network. I know a more just and democratic world is possible. That's why I support.
I support.
I support.
I support.
I support. I support Free Speech TV.
Do you know only a fraction of viewers donate to keep this network on the air? Alarmingly, even fewer donors are stepping up during this drive. We are behind on our fundraising goal, and we need everyone's support, especially yours, today. If you count on truly independent programming uncompromised by corporate or government support, please donate today. Call us at 877-378-8669 or donate online at freespeech.org. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joshua Fouts. I'm the Executive Director of Bioneers, and you're watching Free Speech TV.
Good evening and welcome to the New School. I'd like to begin by acknowledging with respect the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands the New School and this building now stands. So welcome everyone to tonight's event, When Women Lead, Women's Voices Reshaping Our Media. I'm Mary Watson, Executive Dean of the Schools of Public Engagement here at the New School. I want to say just a couple of words about the New School, the place which you're visiting tonight. In 1919, which as it turns out was 100 years ago this year, the New School unveiled a new educational model that was designed to engage the public in open discussions, the shaping of civic life and lifelong learning. And this fall, in celebration of our 100th anniversary, our centennial activities will be entitled the Festival of New, and we'll have a week-long series of events, panels, public programmings, performances, etc., that will be open to the New School wider community, including access to all of our classes that are being taught. So this is October the 1st through 6th, and I invite you to return to join us during that time. One festival program item I would highlight at this moment would be a presentation by the New School's Dr. Gina Laurier-Walker, who's the director of what we call the New Historia Project. So the New Historia tells the story of female-identified people over history, and it's a global platform on which people are writing stories from around the world. But what's new to the New Historia in this year is we've now added the latest digital technology, including virtual reality, which creates a new way of looking at these histories of individuals. So as part of that work, we have a digital archive of more than 400 female-identified people, providing new perspective onto the fields of women's history and biography. And through the iPad version, which is right now in beta, and the VR version, you can actually travel across time visually across the contours, not just of chronology, but also across the contours of the connectedness of how these ideas were shared over history among female-identified people. So for tonight's event, this is another way of crossing contours and connecting across histories. This is a critical conversation at a critical moment in our time. Women have been important in media since its founding and continue to craft new terrains in what needs to be discussed with realistic and open discourse. This includes things like the Me Too movement, the trans right movements, fights for workplace equity and reproductive justice. There are many, many ways in which we're redefining what it means to be a woman and what gender is identified as. So female female identifying people in the media continue to play and are playing an even enhanced role in how our nation confronts our history of gender inequalities. I'm looking forward to hearing more from our panelists tonight about this timely topic, and you've got a very exciting evening ahead of you. So now I thank you for joining the New School, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Clara Jeffrey, who's editor-in-chief of Mother Jones Magazine, to continue tonight's program. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Jean Watson. Really appreciate you welcoming us here to the New School. I am Clara Jeffrey, the editor-in-chief of Mother Jones, and I just wanted to frame this conversation that we're about to have a little bit. You know, when I came up in the media, it was in the aftermath of the Anita Hill hearings. It was a time when women forced open conversations and demanded change, but still, for many years, not only did our political representation remain pitiful, but if anything, our media representation was even worse. There were hardly any women leading news organizations or serving as executive producers or showrunners or power brokers of any kind. And change came slowly. Sometimes it really felt very glacially. But in the past few years, women are again really have reached this pivotal moment to fight for change, demanding to be heard, not just about the sexist and predatory treatment many endured, but a new vanguard of young women is especially insisting on more representation, more power, more diversity. So I could not be more thrilled that Mother Jones is convening a conversation of some of the women making that happen. I'd like to hand off the MC duties to my brilliant colleague, Jamila King, and this exciting panel of women who are helping to revamp the media landscape. Thank you so much. Jamila, come on out.
So I'm going to start right here. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a second, but just a quick announcement. We would love for you to be on the social medias for this. So if you want to tweet using the hashtag #WhenWeLead, I forgot that for a minute, #WhenWeLead, that would be great. And then we also want to make sure that you're a part of the conversation. So we are going to have folks, you should have gotten a little note card. And we would love for you to write a question on there. We'll collect them like shortly before we start Q&A, and I'll read them on stage. So please get that going. So I'm gonna move over here and introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Ali Maloney. Ali is the news and politics editor at Teen Vogue. Welcome, Ali. This is so weird. And next we've got Antonia Hilton. Antonia is an award-winning journalist and correspondent producer with Vice News Tonight. Next we have Kat Aaron, who's a producer at Pineapple Street Media. And then finally we've got Amara Jones, who is the host of The Last Sip and the docuseries Translash. Hey y'all, so basically I just got a panel together of my friends and I was like, let's talk at the New School. So I'm super excited to have you all here. I'm a big fan of your work. And we were talking backstage and I want to ask you all this. It's like a very deep existential question that you probably deal with in therapy. But what is your superpower?
Starting with me, huh? Okay.
Starting with you.
So I was thinking about it, and what I used to think was maybe a weakness is actually what I find to be my superpower now. I think organization might be where the lane that I'm in. It used to be something that I thought was a little bit overbearing, or I was working too much at keeping things in line, but now I realize that it's good to be the one that someone's got to keep it all in line. So I feel like the one that's wrangling, that's me.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Antonia, what about you? Going down the line? We don't have to. Jump around.
So my superpower similarly is also like my kryptonite, which is my relentlessness. It serves me well as a reporter. I don't take no well. I keep trying. I push my stories outside the bounds a lot of the time, and I'm good at that. But I also can be like very hard on myself. And so if I don't feel like things were like quite to the standards I'd set in my mind and made up for myself, I'll be, unkind to myself at times. So it's a double-edged sword, which I think like probably everybody feels the same way about their superpower, right? But
totally.
Definitely relentlessness is what's like gotten me to where I am in my career, but also like is the demon that's like on my back.
It's always the case. What about you, Kat?
Mine is amplification. I, for a long time, sort of struggled with like the fact that I am not a front of house person. I'm like very happy behind the scenes, and we're often told in journalism that like your byline or your voice is the thing that's like the most important thing that you should be striving for, but that's not actually what brings me joy in the work that I do. And I think something that I'm actually very good at is helping voices that need some amplification to find that.
Awesome. And Amara, what about you?
I think my superpower is foresight. And I think that I have the ability to be able to recognize patterns. It's pattern recognition. And like Hermione, there's this scene where they're like, oh, you're the smartest person or whatever. And she goes, no, I'm not. My mind just has the ability to sort of take out the variables that don't matter and to recognize the things that do and to see kind of their significance and where they're going. And that's kind of what I do. And so I think that my superpower is foresight.
So that's a really good place to start this conversation, I think. Amara, I actually want to start with you because some of the work you're doing, all the work you're doing is really powerful, but you had the foresight, I think, probably back in 2014, 2015, when you first started developing the idea for the last sip, which, I want you to tell more about it, but, your show centers around what it means to be, Translash and then the last sip, but Translash focuses on what it means to transition in this political moment. Why was it important for you to tell that story right now?
Yeah, sometimes the problem with foresight is that you're a little too ahead, and so you can end up like the lonely pebble on an empty beach. So timing is everything. So on the last sip, really quickly, the last sip operates from a standard kind of point of view, and that is to say, would it be like to have a news show that actually centered historically marginalized people, their voices, their solutions, the way that they see the world, with the idea that the way that we actually have an engaged citizenry is to talk to everybody. And we developed this half-an-hour show, and I remember when I first went to get funding, funding conversations are so much fun. And when I would go meet with people, they would say, well, why do we need a show like this? Because we have a black president, and we're about to have the first woman president. And I never get asked that anymore. I never get asked that anymore. And I think that we have a sense, we can all relate to this, newsrooms and the way they work, of who the news audience is. Overwhelmingly, even though we're all diverse, we probably have all worked in organizations where the leadership are not us. The leadership are people who are older and who are whiter. And we all know we write for our editors. Our editors are actually the king of the newsrooms. They have the last say on your pieces. They have the ability to green light or not green light. And so it's not an accident that the news looks like the way that it does. And so we came up with something totally different, and it was an experiment. We ran it for 8 weeks last year, and the results were really surprising, and that is to say that at the end of 8 weeks, we had over 100,000, we had an audience of 100,000 people across the country. 66% of them were between the ages of 18 and 35. Half of them were women, and half of them were people of color. It's the exact opposite of what people think people in newsrooms will tell you that audience doesn't exist. And it does. Translash, which I have episode 3 coming out tomorrow, Translash, translash.org, everybody, is really important because it's like, it centers on what it is like to not only transition, but to be trans at a time of social backlash, and particularly a trans person of color. And what's different is, for me as a journalist, is that I'm partially the subject, right? It's so much easier for us to write about other people, and I'm so much more comfortable talking to other people than about myself. But at some point I realized that as a trans woman of color, at this moment, that I am the subject.
Yeah.
Right? And so consequently, I developed a series that explores that and explores that in the wider community. And I think that all of this relates to the fact that, we have to have the power to be able to make decisions about the stories that are important. We have to have the ability to be able to say what needs to be said. We have to have the ability to be able to bring our truth and our perspective to the newsrooms, because everyone does. And because the future looks more like us, it's essential.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Kat, I want to tackle this idea of objectivity, because it was something that we were talking about in the green room. You have a really deep activist past, and you are also a journalist. And you were talking about how something shifted for you after Trump got elected, in terms of how you thought about your work. Can you talk a little bit more
about that? Not sure it was totally after Trump got elected, but I come from. I did economic justice work for a long time, and then my journalism work sort of started. I was the co-director of an organization called People's Production House with my dear friend Deepa Fernandez, who's also a reporter and someone who's been involved in movement work. We were teaching high school and middle school students how to do radio journalism, and then also working with low-wage and immigrant workers organizations doing radio production. And then I was like, oh my God, I'm never gonna make a living like this. I'm going to try to get a master's degree and become like a proper journalist. So I got a master's degree, did like investigative work, and did all the things that you do, and sort of felt like maybe the activist thing I should not talk about that much, because like I didn't want people to think that I was biased or like had a perspective on because like, because then you don't get hired.
You don't get
places. But now I just don't care anymore about that. Partly because I feel like what I actually care about has shifted. That, as I said, like what is important to me is not actually a byline. What I want as a person in the world is like to be present for the people that I love, to advance the things that I care about in the world, and make enough money to like live, but that's, I mean, a lot. So there are ways to do that besides being employed by places that are really fixated on what I think are mostly outdated and irrelevant standards of objectivity. So I just stopped caring about that.
Yeah.
And also just like, we were talking about this, but CNN hired a Republican spokesperson to run their political coverage for the 2020 campaign, or to be part of that leadership. And it was just sort of like, well, all right, why am I worrying about this? Like, that just, I don't know, doesn't seem like it matters anymore.
Yeah.
That's right.
Antonia, one of the first pieces you did after the election, I remember feeling really like healed by.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it was a look at this sort of trend of Black women leaving the U.S. and going on basically like political and personal hiatus in this like oasis in Costa Rica. One, how did you find that story? And then two, why was that important for you to do right after the election?
So how I found that story, that is like the definition of an organic story, organic storytelling. Like, no source leaked that information to me. No lawyer called me up and said, what's going on down here, which is how a lot of, like as a civil rights and often immigration reporter, like that's how a lot of my work gets done. This was a story that happened because I'm Black and my producer is Black. And we were having conversations with our friends and family and hearing the same thing over and over again post-Trump's election. I feel really racially alienated. I'm terrified about what's going on at a national level in this country. I'm noticing different behaviors from white coworkers, white neighbors, a lot of Black people who were working and or living in spaces where they were like one of or two of, any group of people of color in the places that they spend most of their time. And so we kept hearing, like, I'm booking a vacation and I'm only bringing, like, my black girlfriends. I'm going to Joburg instead of Paris. I was thinking about going to Iceland like everyone else, but now actually I'm going to this part of Costa Rica that's really black. And we were like, oh, we've heard this now like a million times. So I did some research, found out from people who do travel, marketing, measurement, that actually black single women had become the most likely group of people to travel abroad in the whole US. And that's big, because when you think about people who travel globally, you think of wealthy white people. Often people think black people don't travel, period, or that if they do travel, they're like just going to the Dominican Republic or, you know? And it turned out that actually the data showed that black women were trying to go all over the globe, and that had ticked up recently. So we felt validated in that. Then we did some research, and there were all these retreats offering specific experiences for black women. And then we landed on a retreat that was doing a retreat for black women only, and was going to make, and that retreat was explicitly political. There were going to be discussions, there were going to be efforts to have sort of raw conversations around healing post-election. They had brought in a professor from a university who was going to have an entire presentation on sort of like slavery to mass incarceration to how we got to Trump, and we thought that was amazing. And so we met a ton of these women and we're like, hey, can we join your vacation? And so for me and Tracy Jarrett, who's the producer I work with, it was, like you said, it's like one of those stories where you realize you're also the subject, which is a really interesting way to do your reporting. And it's always if there are young reporters or aspiring reporters in the room, it's always an interesting way to figure out, to start learning what your voice is and where you're gonna make a mark in this industry, is like, actually just start by interrogating yourself a little bit. Because that's often like, this story blew up, you know, because we had a really raw conversation. A lot of people who consider themselves, you know, news people who are up on what's going on were shocked to hear that black people felt that way.
In the sense that Teen Vogue was an established brand when we took the turn into the space that we're in now, which was in like 2014, 2015. But Teen Vogue, I think, had been a brand for 13 or 14 years, and a beauty and fashion brand. So with that being celeb covers and all sorts of relationships that were with young artists in the music industry. So for us to kind of combine those worlds has been really fun and really interesting, especially as celebrities start to feel more comfortable being political, being themselves, talking about their identity, and not and without that fear of it's going to totally ruin their career, especially young people, especially young queer people coming out of the closet and talking to us about it. Being able to open that door to be able to work with the entertainment industry in a way that kind of flips it on its head, starting with the youngest group of people and kind of choosing who the stars are and centering the ones whose messages kind of align with the political messages that we're trying to talk about too, which is, you know, standing up for yourself and standing up for people around you.
Yeah. I remember watching an episode of Blackish, and I forget what season it was, but like, there was Teen Vogue in an episode of Blackish.
Yeah, I think Elaine was in that one.
Yeah, so that's been really great to see.
Yeah.
So I want to pivot a little bit to the upcoming election. And Amara, you mentioned something about foresight. I want to talk a little bit about what are the lessons that you learned in the first election you were really able to be aware of, whether you could vote or not? What are some of the lessons that you learned that you think are prescient looking at 2020?
The first election that I voted in, so probably the one that's the clearest memory, was in 2018, and it was John McCain and Barack Obama. And I was a Southerner who had just moved to college, and I was dead set that I was going to vote for John McCain. Now I think about that and I laugh pretty hard because that's ridiculous. But my parents were veterans, and there was all of this, you know, rah-rah after 9/11 that my parents got swept into, and so my set of ideals was not actually my own. So when I think about the upcoming election, and I remember myself at 18 walking into that booth and thinking, like, of course it's Barack Obama, what was I thinking before this? I think about the young people that maybe this past election was their very first, or maybe they couldn't vote and now they can vote now. So I sort of see the way that the world and the political world has escalated, and they've come of age in that. So I'm really curious to see how 2020 is going to go in terms of racial demographic and the breakdown, because in my first election, white people still overwhelmingly voted for John McCain. And we've seen this in elections in the midterms now, that white people are still consistently voting for other white people and for people that sort of rile up those fears. And I think that for 2020 to have the same candidate that we had, who's been so, racist and divisive throughout his entire candidacy and then presidency, I'm curious to see what Democrats do. I'm curious to see what the left, how they're going to approach this.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in? You don't have to. But
I mean, the first election, I'm older. I'm 41. The first election I voted in was the second Clinton election. And the thing that really weirds me out thinking about it, of course, was that like a couple years later, all of this stuff broke about Monica Lewinsky, and I just had no read on it. None of it was I did not identify with her as a young woman at all. It did not occur to me that she was pretty close in age to me, more or less a peer of mine. It just wasn't on my radar in that lens at all. I mean, it was sort of Letterman's making fun of this person. And I think that won't happen again in that same way because of social media, and there's more things translating political conversations explicitly at young people, including Teen Vogue. But it does make me think about who we are hearing about but not hearing from in the political conversation, and who is sort of the subject of political discussion but not actually being given voice.
Yeah. That actually reminds me of I forgot the name of the podcast, but there's a podcast that looked at Clinton's scandal and how Monica Lewinsky played a pivotal role. Slow burn, yes. Which gets me to talk a little bit about podcasts, because if you don't listen to one, then you're probably making one. And I feel like the way that people are talking about podcasts nowadays are that they are going to change the game for everybody. They are going to make us more inclusive. They are going to give people who've traditionally not been able to tell stories a platform to tell those stories. I feel like it's a similar conversation that we had to blogs in the early 2000s. And there's some good things about that, and there's some not so good things about that. Kat, can you talk a little bit about the opportunities and the risks associated with the conversation we're having right now about storytelling and podcasts?
Yes, lots of feelings about it. I debriefed with some colleagues, I think we're gonna talk about this. And they were yeah, we all have a lot of feelings about it. So yes, obviously you are literally able to hear from many different kinds of people through podcasting. You can hear more voices, hear voices that any kind of you maybe didn't hear or have access to before. So that is lovely and wonderful. I think there are a lot of risks involved in this moment in podcasting. Risk is maybe too strong a word, but things that I am concerned about. One of which is looking at who is getting paid to make podcasts as opposed to who is actually making podcasts. So people that I know who are making amazing podcasts, our friends Adrienne Marie Brown and her sister Autumn Brown make an incredible podcast called How to Survive the End of the World, which is just a side hustle. And I think that we are really running a risk of replicating the very white structures that we see in a lot of the rest of the media, in that there are people of every kind of person doing incredible work, but the vast majority of the people who are given the opportunity to be paid to do that work are white. So I think that remains true. The New York Magazine just did this feature on the podcasting landscape, and there was this graphic of all these little heads that got widely shared on social media of the people running the big podcasting platforms, and it was all white, and that is a source of much conversation in our industry. I think another risk that feels a little bit more subtle to me is that I think podcasting has given So one thing that I think is wonderful is that it's given people who are maybe like the only or one of the onlys in different places, like geographic or emotional or whatever, the chance to like hear and find and like be in an auditory conversation with people who are like them, which I think can be really powerful and like break through isolation. But I think it also gives people a chance to eavesdrop on conversations that they maybe didn't have access to before, which can be like a way to develop empathy and like learn about people whose lives aren't like yours. But it can also, I think, create an illusion that you know more about a community than you actually do, or that you have like insights into a community that's not yours that you may not actually truly have. And I sort of like weirdly existentially worry about that in podcasting, because it is such an intimate medium, but like it, in some ways, like the craft of it can create the illusion that you're having an intimate relationship, an intimate and authentic relationship that you maybe are not actually having. But I also have some thoughts about like how to, one last thing that I think is bad, and then I'll say a couple of positive things. But I think in an evolving industry, one of the things that governs a lot of opportunity is relationship, because like the structures are evolving, and like when things are based on relationship, that can be like problematically perpetuating the racial dynamics that I was talking about who gets access to the work. But I think some great things are happening. There's people working on unionization efforts in the field, which I think creates some more transparency around like pathways and job progression and hiring and all that stuff, which I think is incredibly important. So that is good. And I wrote down a couple more positive things, but I can't think of what they are right now.
Well, no, it's a good start, because I feel like what we're talking about also are pipelines and ecosystems of how do we get jobs, how do we keep jobs, and how do those jobs allow us to tell our stories and tell the stories that are important for us. I think we've each had a very different path into media. I know Antonia and I met in the middle of like startup mania, which was a wild time the past 5 years. We started off 2019 with a ton of layoffs within the journalism industry. Are there any positive sort of lessons that we can take away from how folks are learning how to survive in this moment in media?
I think that what I've taken away from it the most, and we have a column about labor on Teen Vogue right now, because the conversation about labor is so huge, so important. I think that unionizing and people talking about their efforts as newsrooms to kind of band together and protect each other and protect themselves, I think that's been really interesting. I mean, in our own building at Condé Nast, the New Yorker was doing not only advocating for themselves in this way, but they were also spreading information. So I think there's really interesting conversations going on right now about what it means to be a worker in this space. But it is pretty devastating to log on and see, you know, your friends at this publication now don't work there anymore because of X, Y, and Z. And it's been kind of at critical mass for the past year, it feels like, at least.
Yeah. And Amara, I mean, like, it also makes me think about how we talk about these new forms of storytelling and these new opportunities, but you were just in Atlanta, like kind of boots on the ground, and you kind of found a story that you could potentially break.
Yeah.
Don't mind sharing with us right now.
I also wanted to touch on this piece of survival. I think one of the things that I am learning is to not panic. And it's a very interesting thing, right? And what I mean by that is that the industry is rocking and a-rolling, right? But it's still here. And it's still trying to find its way. And even though you've had like 3 jobs in the last 5 years, you still have a job, right? For example, and the same is true for everyone else. And so I think for me, it's getting used to riding the wave and getting comfortable with that. And that just fits into the larger moment of where we are, in a moment of tremendous instability. And our lives, for the rest of our lives, they're not gonna be marked by, you know, placidity. And so I think maybe it's us getting used to riding the waves and trying not to panic. And that's also true for, you know, for everyone else. Easier said than done. On this issue, so one of the things that happened is that I was at Spelman College giving a talk about the need to center the humanity of trans people when we tell trans stories. And I could go on a whole tangent about that. And I screened the episode of Translash that's going to be released tomorrow, which is essentially about how trans people negotiate family. And what family is like for us, how blood family can be a source of strength, a source of pain. When blood families break down, how do we recreate family, and how that recreation of family, often for us and other marginalized people, is the way in which we organize and fight for rights. So we screened that at Spelman, and then in the Q&A came up two separate people who were in authority at Spelman. So Spelman and Morehouse are historically Black colleges. Spelman is an all-women's college, in quotes. Morehouse is an all-men's college, in quotes, even though both have trans students of the opposite gender attending them. And we were told in that space, in real time, by people in authority, so not students, that Morehouse had developed a policy, but had not yet announced the policy. So it was done and dusted at the administrative level to expel students who transition while in college. Just sort of a zero tolerance policy on transness. And we know that people who are at that age are among the most vulnerable. We know that suicide rates for trans people are off the charts, and that particularly that age is a vulnerable age, and policies like this are deeply harmful. But it's not surprising because, again, we do live at a time of social backlash where, Betsy DeVos, who is the Secretary of Education, 2 days ago when asked by a member of Congress, did you realize that when you took away protections for trans students in schools across America, that you were putting them at risk for harassment and greater suicide? She replies, I did know. Just kind of with impunity. So I think, particularly as kind of all of us, the way in which the society is bending the rules against us all in various ways, it makes it harder and harder and harder for us to both have a neutral voice and tell the truth. Right? We can't have a neutral voice of God voice when, they're saying that women can have abortion after 2 weeks. Right? The control over your body is an essential thing in society. You can't report on that and be like, well, both sides.
Right. Both sides matter.
Can I speak to that?
Go for it, yeah.
One thing that I feel very lucky about at Teen Vogue is that when we launched the section, which was 2 years ago, the news and politics section specifically, we came at it knowing that we didn't have to be both sides. We stand for this. We stand for social justice. We stand with LGBTQ people. So we knew what lane we were going to be in, and it's such a relief to kind of see what's happened even in the last 2 years of people kind of chipping away and breaking down that wall, because it's not necessarily real. And so to have young people too telling their stories in that way, and now they're kind of joined by a chorus of voices of people looking around saying, yeah, it's not normal. I'm going to report on it, but this isn't normal. it's really refreshing.
Yeah. So we're in this moment, post Me Too, where the conversation has sort of shifted, and especially in newsrooms, to talking about how to create safe and supportive newsrooms for women and women of color, but also how we rely on each other, like how we survive, how we have survived. How have these sort of self-reliance or mutual aid networks worked for you in your career? So the thing happens, you don't go to HR, you go to your homies in the office. That's how it's usually played out for me. Why are those so important, and do you think those are ultimately detrimental to changing things institutionally?
I can take this one.
Go for it.
So the first thing I should say is that that idea of relying on the women around you in the office, that's been true for me since my start of my career. So pre-Me Too movement, the only people who've ever hired me are women. Mm-hmm. All of my producers have been women. A lot of them are women of color. At Vice, most of the women who make our show on HBO are women. Most of the people who make that show are, like, our executive producer is a woman. You know, my senior producer is a Chinese woman. My old senior producer is a black woman who's now in DC, running the entire politics bureau. Like, we are a newsroom that doesn't really look like what I think a lot of people think news feels like. And so in that sense, I've been lucky. But then also I've been at a company that experienced the Me Too movement, right? And its own Me Too moment. And that's when I saw the informal network really become more formalized. And that formalizing process can look like a couple different things, like a Slack room that showed up just for women, another Slack room just for black women, you know, where you can start talking about things happening in the office and know that you're talking to people who will understand and who you won't be trying to explain, like, from, you know, home base, like, what's going on. You're already there with them, and you have that level of comfort. They understand the same landscape that you're in, or the people that you're concerned about, or the questions you have. There became a culture around even just the pitching of our stories, where women were really careful to reach out to each other when they wanted to cover a story, but really center women in the sort of larger scheme of something that maybe men would often be at the center of. So we have a woman who does a ton of our, like, climate reporting. We cover politics from a million different angles, but a lot of the politics stories I do without, you know, like, flashing, like, women in politics. This is a story about lady politics, boss ladies. It's like, we just put a woman at the center of that thing. We went to interview a state's attorney who is a black woman. We interview women who are at the center of, who are advocates on the front lines of working on Amendment 4 issues in Florida. And it's not about the fact that they're women, but the fact that you just put women in that representational role. There were a lot more conversations among the women producers and creators at Vice about, you know, thinking about, like, let's reflect on the representation in our own coverage, and how do we work together to make sure that we keep doing a better and better job at it. And so I would say that, like, informally, I had that support. You know, there were women around me always wanting to see me do better and be better at Mike when I was there with you, but then at Vice for the last several years. But now I would say there's, like, a real emphasis on it, that, like, every day you go in with the intention of, like, lifting each other up, and that's been really cool.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I would say going in and lifting each other up has been a big point of focus in our newsroom, especially, we were talking before this about go out and don't be depressing, because talking about these topics can be so, you know, there's a lot going on and it all has feeling, but going in every day and trying to, now we take the time to walk and get the coffee and either unload or giggle a whole bunch, but trying to put each other first and recognize that the work is going to be there when we get back, but having to look out for each other first.
Yeah, Amari, I think you said something.
Yeah, I was just going to say really briefly that I think the formalization of these informal networks is really important, because the Old Boys Network was informal too, right? The way in which, like, men in organizations mentor each other and get together informally and strategize, and there's a whole informality of it. And of course, it's been discouraged amongst everyone else, because you don't want to be seen as being a threat to the power structure, and you want to try to, the whole thing of trying to fold into the existing authority, but realizing that that's not working, and creating alternatives, parallel structures, is actually the way that you shift power in organizations. And I think that the example that you gave, and to be hopeful, overall what's happening is that the pressure and the change in society is forcing people who are like-minded to come together and to work with each other. It's because it's a very clarifying moment, and there's so many ways in which we've seen that, from people on the streets to to individual women having the courage to come forward and tell their stories and know that there are other women who will report on them. So with Dream Hampton, for example, and R. Kelly. So there is a lot of hope in the mess, and coming together in these networks across divisions and lines is actually really hopeful.
Yeah.
But I think the informal networks too can be really helpful for the gut check of, like, wait, is this actually as terrible as I think it is? Like, maybe it's so terrible that we all just need to leave this place. Like, I'm not crazy. This whole situation is crazy. And just being able to have those conversations so you're not like constantly gaslighting yourself at work. And just like validating to the people around you, like, oh, it's actually okay if what you want to do is find a place where you can do the work that you came here to do, rather than simultaneously trying to do the work of like educating your white colleagues or educating your male colleagues and transform an institution. Like, it's okay if you just don't want to do that, and you can find a place where you don't have to do that. Like, that's good and fine, and like, it's not your job is to tell the best stories you can tell, not necessarily to like transform an institution that may or may not be willing to hear you.
Right. Because that's labor, right? We don't often talk about it as labor.
Sure.
But that's a huge, huge amount of labor that women often do in newsrooms. I want to talk about the election again. So there was a thread of a story that was happening recently where it was basically like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren would be more likable if they jumped up on tables like Beto O'Rourke and yelled at people, basically, like yell and jump on tables.
Do the sleeve.
Roll up your sleeves. Just be more off the cuff. Be more.
If they jumped up more
likable,
on tables?
Yeah, because that's what Beto does. I mean, no offense to the Beto lovers in this room, but he does jump on a lot of tables.
Tell him to sit down.
He's got a lot going on here. So
give him socks. You can give him socks from now on.
He has socks? What?
No, you said he has a lot going on down at.
He must have an extraordinary amount of like lower body strength to be able to jump on those skateboards, right? Like,
he's also really tall, so why he has to do that?
But so this became, amid all the actual political stories, this became a thing, right? People saying that Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren and this historic number of women who are running for president need to be more likable, and one way to do that is to jump on tables. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what it boiled down to. I felt like the only people to really check that were women on Twitter, to be like, this is fucked up. Do you think that we have more women in media now than we've ever had before? Do you think that actually makes a difference in how these stories are being told? I mean, obviously, if folks are on Twitter and they're calling this stuff out, that's one thing. But like the fact that was even a story to begin with is troubling to me. What do y'all think?
You made the point that it all comes back to the editor, right? And that's the final line. That seems like that editor made a really bad call. I think that those kinds of stories are dated and that there are going to be fewer and fewer. I think that the way that women are, we were just talking about Me Too and being sure that a woman was going to report on your story if you were to tell it. I mean, that's reflected in the newsroom. So I think the way that we're talking about politics is really interesting with the amount of women looking around the room and saying, we see different things than other groups of people would see. So I think that more interesting stories are being found. The kinds of stories that weren't being told before, everything's a story now. So you're really able to seek out these interesting, I think that you have to be more dynamic about the way that you're reporting on women candidates, though. Like that, don't tell Elizabeth Warren to jump on a table. Tell her to address X, Y, and Z.
Right. Yeah. Or even just the fact that old stories are being looked at in a new light. Like Joe Biden, no, you cannot sexually assault people every time you meet them. But anyway.
One of the most interesting things is that there was talk in newsrooms. This tells you how little newsrooms actually change, because actually, just as a statistic, the Columbia Law Review did a review of newsrooms and their diversity and found that in print publications, that the level of diversity in newsrooms at the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the LA Times is at the exact same levels that it was in the 1970s. It actually hasn't changed. Diversity in the mainstream network newsrooms and cable newsrooms was so bad that they wouldn't even report the numbers. Just refused to answer the survey. But there was talk after this last time that there was going to be this revolution in how we cover candidates. realizing that, one, there was too much of the horse race last time, but that also, Hillary Clinton did get knocked because of just the style of candidate that she was. And in her book, it's actually a really fascinating read. Anyone interested in politics should read it, because it's actually an honest, sometimes painfully honest, review of herself and the mistakes that she made. But one of the things that came out constantly is that she was told and shown a study, and it bore out through her experience, that the higher that women rise, the more likely they are to succeed, the less people like them. Mm-hmm. It's the exact opposite for men, right? It's in the inverse. And there was an understanding in newsrooms that this dynamic had been at work in the way that editors were deciding to cover the story, and that there was going to be a rethink of how we cover women candidates. That clearly hasn't happened. Mm-hmm. because gender bias and misogyny are so wired into the atmosphere that it is so incredibly hard to realize that you're doing it when you're doing it. So I think that that editor thought that it was a legitimate news story and that it was good. I think for those two candidates, if you've ever been up close to them, Jamila, you've been with Kamala Harris, they are being authentic. That's who they are. If she were to get up on a table in her kitten heels and the pearls that she wears around her neck, it would look absolutely ridiculous. Like Elizabeth Warren